I was the Grand Imam of Mecca, but I met Jesus, who died on the cross, and my life changed.
My name is Sheikh Abdul Karim Al-Makki. That was a short clip from my public declaration of Jesus Christ on Wednesday, April 23, 2024. That single video caused an earthquake across Saudi Arabia that the regime is still trying to recover from. Massive protests erupted in Makkah, Riyadh, Jeddah, Medina, and every major city in the kingdom. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims took to the streets demanding my head. The Saudi government scrambled to suppress the video, blocking it on every platform, issuing takedown orders, flooding the internet with claims that it was a deepfake produced by Israeli intelligence. They stripped me of my title. They erased my name from the records of the Grand Mosque. They forced my own brother to disown me on national television. The persecution my family has endured because of my decision is still causing me a pain I cannot put into words. But I understand the rage. I do. Because what I did is unprecedented in the history of Islam. The Grand Imam of the Grand Mosque of Mecca, the man who stands at the microphone in front of the Kaaba and leads the entire Muslim world in prayer, publicly converting to Christianity. And not just converting quietly in some foreign country, converting after an encounter with Jesus Christ that happened inside the Grand Mosque itself during Ramadan on Laylat al-Qadr, the most sacred night in the Islamic calendar. And to add fuel to the fire, I was not some moderate Muslim with doubts about his faith. I was the most aggressive, the most vocal, the most relentless enemy of Christianity in the Islamic world. I oversaw the persecution of Christians inside Saudi Arabia. I burned their Bibles with my own hands. I traveled to European capitals and publicly humiliated the name of Jesus on international television. I mocked every Muslim who claimed Jesus appeared to them in dreams, calling them mentally ill and demon-possessed. I was the last man on earth anyone would expect to bow before Jesus Christ. So, how did it happen? How did the Grand Imam of Mecca, the Lion of Islam, the #1 hater of the name of Jesus, end up sitting in front of a camera in Europe declaring that Jesus is the Son of the living God? Follow my story. Every word of it is true. And by the end, you will understand why the Saudi regime is terrified. Not of me, of the lion who found me. I was born in 1966 in the Al-Rusaifa district of Makkah, less than 2 kilometers from the Grand Mosque. My family has served the Grand Mosque for 4 generations. My great-grandfather was a muezzin who climbed the minaret before dawn to call the faithful to Fajr prayer in the years before loudspeakers existed. My grandfather was an imam who led prayers at the mosque for 30 years. My father, Sheikh Muhammad Al-Makki, served as a senior imam and member of the Religious Advisory Council for 25 years before retiring. The Grand Mosque was not just our place of worship, it was our inheritance, our bloodline, our identity. The Al-Makki family and the Grand Mosque were woven together like threads in a carpet. You could not separate one from the other. I was born into this legacy the way a prince is born into royalty. Not by choice, but by divine appointment. At least that is what I believed for 57 years of my life. I memorized the entire Quran by the time I was 12 years old. Not because I was forced, but because the Quran lived inside the walls of our home the way oxygen lived inside the air. My father recited it every morning. My mother recited it while she cooked. My older brother recited it while he studied. The sound of Quranic recitation was the soundtrack of my childhood. I absorbed it the way a sponge absorbs water, effortlessly, completely. By the time I was a teenager, I could recite all 114 surahs from memory, without a single error. My father would test me randomly at the dinner table. He would say Surah 54 verse 32, and I would close my eyes and recite from that exact verse forward without hesitation. He would nod with approval, which was the highest form of praise he ever offered. My father did not give compliments, he gave nods, and each nod was worth more to me than 1,000 words of praise from anyone else. I was enrolled at the Islamic University of Medina when I was 18. This was the most prestigious Islamic institution in the world, Students came from over 160 countries to study there. The faculty included scholars whose names were known across the entire Muslim world. I studied under men who had dedicated their lives to understanding every word and every letter and every vowel marking of the Quran. I studied Aqidah, which is Islamic theology, Fiqh, which is Islamic jurisprudence, Usul al-Fiqh, which is the principles of jurisprudence, Tafsir, which is Quranic interpretation, Hadith, which is the study of the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. I graduated at the top of my class with the highest honors the university had ever awarded. My professor said I was the most gifted student they had seen in a generation. They said I had a voice that could move mountains and a mind that could split atoms. They said I was destined for greatness. And they were right. But the greatness they imagined for me and the greatness that God had actually planned for me turned out to be two very different things. I returned to Makkah after graduation and began serving as a junior imam at the Grand Mosque under my father's supervision. I led smaller prayers. I delivered short lectures. I assisted senior imams during Hajj and Ramadan when the mosque was at its fullest and the demand for qualified prayer leaders was highest. I proved myself quickly. My voice was powerful and melodic. My recitation was flawless. My knowledge of Islamic law was encyclopedic. Within 5 years, I was promoted to a full imam position. Within 10 years, I was appointed to the Senior Council of Imams who rotated the responsibility of leading the 5 daily prayers and the Friday sermon at the Grand Mosque. And within 15 years, I was given the title that my family had been building toward for 4 generations. Grand Imam of the Grand Mosque of Makkah, the highest religious position in Sunni Islam at the holiest site on earth. The day I received the appointment, I went to my father, who was by then elderly and confined to a wheelchair in our family home in Al-Rusaifa. I knelt beside him and told him the news. He looked at me with eyes that had grown cloudy with age but still burned with the same intensity they had when he tested my Quran recitation at the dinner table decades earlier. He reached out his thin hand and placed it on my head. He did not smile. He simply said, Alhamdulillah. Then he closed his eyes and I saw a tear roll down his withered cheek. It was the only time I ever saw my father cry. He died 3 months later, peacefully, in his sleep, in the house where he was born to, kilometers from the mosque he had served his entire life. I led his funeral prayer at the Grand Mosque. 200,000 people attended. I stood at the front of those rows with my father's body wrapped in white cloth on the ground before me, and I recited the funeral prayer with a voice that did not tremble because I was the Grand Imam, and the Grand Imam does not tremble. But inside I was breaking, because the man who had shaped me into what I was lay silent at my feet, and the weight of his legacy now sat entirely on my shoulders. I carried that weight with ferocity. I did not just serve as Grand Imam. I became a warrior, a lion, the self-appointed defender of Islam against every threat, real or imagined, that dared to challenge the supremacy of Muhammad's religion. I sat on the chief council of Sharia law in the kingdom. I helped draft religious rulings that governed the lives of millions. I advised the government on matters of Islamic policy. I issued fatwas that carried the weight of divine authority. And I made it my personal mission to ensure that no other religion gained even the smallest foothold in the land of the 2 holy mosques. Christianity was my primary target, not because I feared it, because I despised it. I despised the claim that Jesus was the Son of God. I despised the doctrine of the Trinity. I despised the idea that God would lower himself to become a human being and die on a cross like a criminal. I saw Christianity as the greatest insult to the majesty of Allah, and I dedicated myself to destroying it wherever I found it. Inside the kingdom, outside the kingdom, in every debate, on every platform, in every country I visited. I was the hammer that fell on the cross, and I swung with all my might. What the world saw of me was a respected scholar and religious leader who defended Islam with intellectual rigor and theological precision. What the world did not see was the other side of my war against Christianity, the side that operated in, Darkness behind walls that no journalist could penetrate and no camera could reach. The site that I ran personally with the cooperation of the Mabahith, the Saudi secret police, and the full backing of the religious establishment. I was not just a man who debated Christians on television. I was a man who hunted them. Inside the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, there exists a network of persecution so sophisticated and so secret that the international human rights organizations that claim to monitor religious freedom have never come close to uncovering its true scope. I know this because I helped build it, I helped design the protocols, I helped train the religious police units that carried out the operations, and I took personal satisfaction in every single raid, every single arrest, and every single Bible that was confiscated and burned in my presence. The operations worked like this. The Mabahith maintained a dedicated unit focused on what they called religious security. This unit monitored internet activity across the kingdom, flagging any Saudi citizen who searched for Christian content online. They monitored social media accounts. They tracked encrypted messaging applications. They planted informants inside communities of foreign workers, particularly Filipino, Indian, Ethiopian, and Eritrean communities, where Christianity was most prevalent. When they identified a gathering of Christians meeting secretly in an apartment or a labor camp dormitory, they would plan a raid with the precision of a military operation. I was consulted before every major raid. I reviewed the intelligence. I approved the timing. And on several occasions, I personally accompanied the raiding teams because I wanted to see the fear in the eyes of these people who dared to worship a false god in the land of Muhammad. I remember one raid in particular that I accompanied in the Al-Nakil district of Riyadh. It was a Friday evening. The Mabahith had identified a group of approximately 30 Filipino workers who were meeting in a small apartment on the 4th floor of a residential building. They had been gathering every Friday for months, singing, praying, reading from Bibles they had smuggled into the country inside their luggage. The informant who had infiltrated the group reported that they were led by a woman named Maria, who worked as a nurse at a hospital in Riyadh. She had been holding these meetings for over 2 years, converting other Filipino workers and even attempting to share her faith with a Saudi co-worker at the hospital. This last detail is what triggered the raid. Proselytizing to a Saudi citizen was a crime of the highest order. It was an attack on the Islamic identity of the kingdom, and I wanted to deal with it personally. We arrived at the building at 9 p.m. 12 Mabahith officers in plain clothes, armed, wearing body cameras that recorded everything for the classified files that would never be made public. I wore my thobe and shimak but no official religious garments. I did not want to be identified as the Grand Imam. My presence was unofficial, off the record. As far as any public document was concerned, I was never there. The officers broke down the door without warning. The sound of the metal door crashing inward was followed by screams, women screaming, men shouting. The officers rushed inside, and I followed. The apartment was small, a single living room with cushions on the floor arranged in a circle, a makeshift altar on a table against the wall with a wooden cross and 2 candles, and a framed picture of Jesus, Bibles scattered on the floor, a guitar leaning against the wall. These people had been worshipping moments before we entered. Some of them were still on their knees. Their faces were frozen in terror. 30 human beings packed into a tiny room, staring at armed men who had just crashed through their door. The officers moved quickly. They confiscated every Bible, every piece of Christian literature, every phone that might contain Christian content. They photographed every face. They recorded every name. They collected identification documents. The wooden cross was ripped from the wall and thrown on the floor. The picture of Jesus was smashed. The candles were knocked over. I stood in the doorway watching all of this with a feeling I can only describe as righteous satisfaction. These people had violated the sanctity of the kingdom. They had brought their false religion into the land of the Prophet, and now they were being dealt with. Maria the nurse was identified immediately. She was a small woman, maybe 40 years old, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore a simple dress and no shoes. She had been kneeling when the door was broken down, and she was still on her knees when the officers grabbed her arms and pulled her to her feet. She did not resist. She did not scream. She looked at the officers with an expression that I did not expect. Not fear, not anger, not defiance. Peace. A calm, steady, peaceful expression that had no business being on the face of a woman who was about to be arrested and deported, and possibly worse. They brought her to stand in front of me. She was small enough that her head barely reached my chest. She looked up at me and our eyes met. I expected to see a broken woman, a woman who realized that her little underground church had been crushed and her mission had failed. But she was not broken. She looked at me the way a mother looks at a child who is misbehaving, with patience, with sadness, with something that I refused to acknowledge in that moment, but that would haunt me for years afterward. It was pity. She pitied me. This tiny Filipino nurse is standing in handcuffs in a room full of armed men in the most powerful Islamic country on earth. Pitied me. The Grand Imam of the Grand Mosque of Makkah, she pitied me. I leaned down close to her face and I said in English, "Where is your Jesus now?" She looked at me without flinching and she said, "He is here. He is always here. Even now. Even in this room. He's standing right beside you, Sheikh. You just cannot see him yet." I stepped back as if she had slapped me. Her words hit me harder than any physical blow I had ever received. I turned away from her and ordered the officers to take them all to the processing center. They were loaded into vans and driven away. Maria and 3 other leaders of the group were charged with proselytizing and held in detention for 6 weeks before being deported back to the Philippines. The others were deported within days. The apartment was sealed. The Bibles were taken to a facility where they were incinerated. I watched them burn. Stacks of books with pages that curled and blackened in the flames. I stood there watching the fire consume the words of a religion I despised, and I felt nothing but triumph. Or so I told myself. But Maria's words had lodged themselves in my mind like a splinter buried under the skin. He is standing right beside you. Sheikh, you just cannot see him yet. I pushed those words down into the deepest part of my consciousness and buried them under layers of certainty and conviction and religious authority. But they did not stay buried. They festered. They grew. And years later in a room inside the Grand Mosque, they would prove to be prophetic. My war against Christianity extended far beyond the borders of Saudi Arabia. I traveled extensively across Europe and North America, attending interfaith conferences and public debates where I represented Islam against Christian scholars and apologists. But I did not attend these events in the spirit of dialogue or mutual understanding. I attended them as a warrior entering enemy territory. My goal was not to find common ground. My goal was to humiliate Christianity and exalt Islam in front of the largest audiences possible. I debated in London at a university hall packed with over 1,000 people. I debated in Paris at a conference center near the Champs-Élysées. I debated in Berlin and Amsterdam and Brussels and Rome. I stood on the stages across the continent that had once been the heartland of Christianity, and I declared with absolute confidence that Muhammad was superior to Jesus in every measurable way, that the Quran was superior to the Bible, that Islam was the final perfected religion, and Christianity was a corrupted, distorted relic of an earlier revelation that had been superseded and rendered obsolete. I specifically targeted the testimonies of Muslims who claimed to have encountered Jesus in dreams and visions. These stories have been spreading across the Muslim world like a virus, and I saw it as my duty to inoculate the faithful against them. I appeared on Arabic satellite television channels and dismissed these testimonies as psychological disorders. I said the people who claimed to see Jesus in dreams were suffering from hallucinations caused by trauma or mental illness or Western brainwashing. I said the CIA and Mossad were funding Christian missionaries who used sophisticated psychological techniques to manipulate vulnerable Muslims into abandoning their faith. I said there was no power in the name of Jesus, that he was merely a prophet of Allah, a man, a human being, nothing more, and that any Muslim who bowed to him was committing shirk, the unforgivable sin of associating partners with Allah. I said all of this with absolute conviction, standing on stages in European capitals, thousands of kilometers from Makkah, looking into cameras that broadcast my words to millions. And I believed every single word, until the night the lion walked into my room and showed me how wrong I was about everything. It was the 23rd night of Ramadan in the year 2024, the holiest night in the holiest month of the Islamic calendar. Laylat al-Qadr, the night of power. The night that Muslims believe is better than 1,000 months. The night when the Quran was first revealed to the Prophet Muhammad through the angel Jibril in a cave on Mount Hira, overlooking Makkah. Every mosque in the Muslim world was packed that night with worshippers seeking the blessings and forgiveness that tradition said were poured out on this single night more abundantly than on any other night of the year. But the Grand Mosque in Makkah was beyond packed. It was overflowing. Over 3 million worshippers had gathered for the Taraweeh prayers that I led that evening. The courtyard around the Kaaba was a sea of white and green and black, bodies pressed together, shoulder to shoulder in rows, that extended out through every gate and into the surrounding streets. The sound of my voice carried through thousands of speakers mounted on every wall and minaret and pillar of the mosque complex, reaching ears that stretched for over a kilometer in every direction. I led the prayers with everything I had. My voice soared through the recitation of Surah Ar-Rahman. فَبِأَيِّ عَلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ? Which of the favors of your Lord will you deny? The congregation responded with weeping and prostration. I could hear the sobs of millions of people echoing back to me through the speakers like waves crashing against a cliff. This was power, not political power, not military power, spiritual power. The power to move the hearts of millions with the sound of your voice and the words of the book you have memorized since childhood. I felt invincible, standing at the microphone in front of the Kaaba on the night of power. I felt like the mouthpiece of Allah Himself, the chosen vessel through which the divine word flowed to the faithful. No Christian preacher in any church in any country on earth commanded this kind of authority. No pope or bishop or evangelist could stand before 3 million people and move them to tears with a single verse. This was the superiority of Islam made manifest. This was proof that Muhammad's religion was the final and greatest revelation, and I was its voice. The prayers lasted until well past midnight. When the final salam was given and the congregation began to disperse, I remained in the mosque. This was not unusual for me during Ramadan. The Grand Mosque complex contained private quarters reserved for senior religious officials. Small rooms with simple furnishings located in the intersections of the complex away from the public areas. These rooms were used by Imams who needed to rest between prayers during the long nights of Ramadan, when Taraweeh prayers could last until 2 or 3 in the morning, and Fajr prayer would begin again just a few hours later. I had a room that I used regularly. It was simple: a single bed with a thin mattress, a small bathroom, a prayer rug on the floor, a copy of the Quran on a wooden stand beside the bed. The room was located on the second level of the eastern wing of the mosque complex. From its small window, I could see the edge of the Kaaba courtyard below. The marble floors still wet from the washing crews who cleaned them after every prayer session. A few worshippers still making tawaf in the early morning hours, their small figures circling the black cube in the dim light like moths around a flame. I performed my witr prayer, which is the final prayer of the night in Islam. I recited my adhkar, the prescribed remembrances that a Muslim says before sleeping. I lay down on the thin mattress and pulled a light blanket over myself. The air conditioning hummed quietly. The sound of distant footsteps on marble echoed faintly through the walls. I was exhausted. The Ramadan schedule was grueling, even for a man who had been doing it for over 20 years. The fasting during the day, the long hours of prayer at night, the sermons and lectures and meetings with religious officials between prayers. My body was tired, but my spirit was energized. I had just led 3 million people in worship on the night of power. I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was created to do. I closed my eyes and within minutes I was asleep, deeply, completely. The sleep of a man who has no doubts, no questions, no cracks in the fortress of his certainty. I slept like a man who believed he was untouchable, unreachable, beyond the grasp of any power that could challenge him or change him or break him. I do not know what time it was when the sound woke me. It came from somewhere deep, not from outside the room, not from the corridors of the mosque, not from the courtyard below, from somewhere beneath the floor, beneath the foundations, beneath the earth itself. A low rumbling vibration that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. It was like the sound of distant thunder, except it was not distant. It was close, getting closer, growing louder. The vibration intensified until the walls of the room began to tremble. The copy of the Quran on the wooden stand rattled. The glass of water beside my bed rippled. I sat up in bed, my heart suddenly pounding. My first thought was earthquake. Makkah sat in a seismically active region and minor tremors were not unheard of, but this did not feel like an earthquake. Earthquakes were chaotic, random. This vibration had a rhythm, a pattern, a pulse, like a heartbeat, like something alive was moving beneath the mosque, coming closer, rising upward through the ancient stones and marble and concrete toward me. Then the sound broke through the floor. Not physically, the floor did not crack, the marble did not split, but the sound exploded upward through the room like a geyser of pure acoustic force, and I recognized it. Every human being on earth would recognize it. It was a roar, the roar of a predator, the roar of the most powerful land animal God ever created, a lion. But not the roar of any lion I had ever heard in a zoo or a documentary. This roar was magnified 1,000 times. It shook the room with a violence that threw me off the bed onto the floor. The windows rattled in their frames. The wooden Quran stand toppled over. The glass of water shattered. I lay on the floor on my hands and knees, shaking so violently that my teeth were chattering. I tried to speak. I tried to recite Ayat al-Kursi, the verse of the throne that Muslims recite for protection against evil. But my mouth would not form the words. My tongue was frozen. My lips were locked. For the first time in my life, the words of the Quran would not come when I called them. The book I had memorized at 12 years old. The book I had recited for millions. The book I had built my entire identity upon. It was silent, locked away behind a door in my mind that someone had sealed shut. The room began to change. The fluorescent light on the ceiling flickered and died, but darkness did not follow. Instead, a different light filled the room. Not electric light, not candlelight, not moonlight through the window. A golden light, warm, dense, alive. It poured into the room from every direction, as if the walls themselves had become transparent and the sun on. The other side was shining through. The light was so thick I could feel it on my skin. It had weight. It had texture. It pressed against me like warm water surrounding a body in a bath. And in the center of the room, where the light was most concentrated, something was forming. A shape, a mass of golden luminescence that was coalescing into a form that made every hair on my body stand on end. 4 legs, a massive body, a tail, and a mane. A mane that blazed like fire, like a crown of living flames surrounding a head the size of a boulder. Eyes that burned like molten gold poured into 2 craters of infinite depth. A mouth that opened to reveal teeth that could crush stone. The lion stood in the center of my room, inside the Grand Mosque of Makkah. And it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen in my entire life. I pressed myself against the wall behind me, trying to get as far from the creature as possible. My back hit the cold marble and I had nowhere else to go. I was trapped, cornered. A man who had called himself the Lion of Islam was now cowering before a real lion whose presence made him feel like an insect. The lion looked at me, its golden eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the gaze penetrate through my skull, through my brain, through every layer of thought and memory and identity, until it reached the very core of who I was. It saw everything, every sermon I had ever preached, every Christian I had ever persecuted, every Bible I had ever burned, every word I had ever spoken against the name it represented. It saw Maria, the Filipino nurse, looking up at me in handcuffs, saying, "He is standing right beside you." It saw me leaning into her face, asking, "Where is your Jesus now?" It saw all of it, and then it opened its mouth, not to roar, to speak. The voice that came from the lion was not the sound of an animal. It was a voice of absolute authority, deep as the foundations of the earth, resonant as thunder, rolling across a mountain range, speaking perfect Arabic, the Arabic of the Quran, the Arabic of my childhood, the Arabic of my identity. The lion said, "I am the lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David. I have conquered death and hell and the grave. You have spent your life fighting me, Sheikh Abdul Karim. Now look at me and see who I really am." The lion began to change. The massive body that had filled the center of the room with its terrifying power started to shift. The golden mane that blazed like a crown of fire began to recede. The four legs that could crush marble started to reshape. The enormous head with its burning eyes began to transform into something different, something that was somehow even more overwhelming than the lion had been, because the lion had inspired terror. What replaced it inspired something far more devastating to a man like me. It inspired awe. The kind of awe that strips away every title and every achievement and every layer of religious authority you have ever accumulated and leaves you standing naked before a power so far above you that the distance between you cannot be measured with any instrument known to man. The golden light intensified as the transformation continued. The shape shifted from animal to human, from 4 legs to 2. From a mane of fire to a head of white hair that shone like refined silver. From the body of a predator to the body of a man, but not an ordinary man. A man who wore the light the way other men wore clothes. A man whose white robe was not fabric, but woven radiance. A man whose feet were like burnished bronze glowing as if they had been heated in a furnace. A man whose face shone with a brilliance that made the golden light of the lion seem dim by comparison. He stood before me, Jesus, Isa al-Masih, the man I had spent my entire career mocking and denying and fighting against. The man I had called merely a prophet. The man I had publicly declared had no power and no divinity and no authority beyond what Allah had temporarily granted him as a messenger. That man was standing in my room inside the Grand Mosque of Mecca, radiating a glory that I had never seen attributed to any being in any Islamic text I had ever studied. This was not a prophet. Prophets do not glow. Prophets do not transform from lions into men. Prophets do not fill rooms with light that has weight and texture and personality. This was something else entirely. Something that the Quran had no category for. Something that my decades of Islamic scholarship had no framework to process. This was God in human form, and he was looking at me with eyes that saw everything I had ever done, and everything I had ever been, and everything I was at that exact moment cowering against a wall. In a room I had slept in 100 times believing I was untouchable. He raised his hands slowly, palms up, and I saw the scars. On each palm a wound, not fresh, not bleeding, healed but permanent. Round and deep like the mark left by a large nail being driven through flesh and bone. The crucifixion wounds. The wounds that I had spent my entire career denying existed. The Quran said in Surah An-Nisa, they did not kill him, and they did not crucify him, but it was made to appear so to them. I had quoted that verse 1,000 times on stages across Europe. I had used it to dismiss the central claim of Christianity. Jesus was not crucified. He did not die on a cross. Allah saved him and raised him to heaven, and someone else was put on the cross in his place. That was what I believed. That was what I taught. That was what I built my entire theological fortress upon. And now the man standing in front of me was showing me the scars that proved the fortress was built on a lie. The crucifixion happened. The nails were real. The wounds were real. The scars were real. And the man who bore them was standing in the holiest site in Islam, showing them to the man who had denied them most passionately. He spoke. His voice was nothing like the roar of the lion. It was gentle, measured, patient. The voice of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this conversation and was in no hurry now that it had begun. He said Abdul Karim, just my name. But the way he said it carried the weight of 1,000 sermons. It was not a greeting, it was a statement. A declaration that he knew me, not the public me, not the grand Imam, not the scholar or the debater or the lion of Islam. The real me, the one hiding behind all the titles and the authority and the righteous fury. The one who had never been seen by anyone. Not my father, not my colleagues. Not the 3 million worshippers who hung on every word of my recitation. He saw me, the real me. And the real me was terrified, not of punishment, not of hell. Terrified of being known, of being exposed, of having every mask ripped away and every wall torn down, and being left standing before a God who saw through everything. He said, I have been watching you. I watched you when you were 12 years old, memorizing the Quran in your father's house. I watched you when you stood at the microphone for the first time and led prayers at my father's creation. I watched you when you buried your father and led his funeral prayer without letting your voice tremble. I watched you rise through the ranks of a religion that was built on incomplete truths about me, and I watched you become my enemy. I watched you hunt my people. I watched you raid the room where Maria and her brothers and sisters were worshipping me. I watched you lean into her face and ask, where is your Jesus now? And I heard her answer, he is standing right beside you. She was right, Abdul Karim. I was standing right beside you in that room. I was standing beside you on every stage in every European city where you mocked my name. I was standing beside you every time you burned my word. I was in every room you entered and at every table where you sat planning the persecution of my children. You never saw me, but I never left your side. Because I was not following you to judge you. I was following you to save you. The words hit me like a succession of blows, each one landing deeper than the last. He was not angry. That was the most disorienting part. I had expected anger. I had expected the wrath of a deity who had been insulted and blasphemed and denied by a man who should have known better. I deserved anger. I deserved fury. I deserved the kind of divine retribution that the Quran described in vivid detail for those who opposed God's messengers. But there was no anger in his voice. There was no condemnation in his eyes. There was something else. Something I had never encountered in all my years of Islamic scholarship and practice. There was love, not the distant impersonal love of a creator for his creation that Islam described. Personal love, specific love, love that knew my name and my history and my sins and loved me anyway. Love that had been watching me persecute his followers and had responded not with punishment, but with patience. Love that had waited 57 years for this moment. I did not know what to do with that love. I had no framework for it. Islam taught me that Allah's love was conditional, that it was earned through obedience and lost through disobedience, that God loved the righteous and despised the wicked. But this love was not conditional. It was not earned. It was given freely, completely, to a man who had spent his life earning divine hatred by every standard he had ever been taught. He continued speaking, and every word dismantled another wall of the fortress I had built around myself. He said, "You have burned my word, Abdul Karim. You have taken the Bibles from the hands of my children and thrown them into fires. You have watched the pages curl and blacken, and you have felt righteous. But I want you to know that my word cannot be destroyed by fire, because my word is not ink on paper. My word is spirit and life. Every Bible you burned still exists in the hearts of the people who read it before you took it from them. Every verse you destroyed still echoes in the souls of believers who memorized it before you confiscated it. You burned paper. You did not burn truth. And the truth is standing in front of you right now. I am the word. I am the truth that no fire can consume. I am the light that no darkness can overcome. And I am here in this room, in this mosque, in this city that you believe belongs to another, to tell you that it is time to stop fighting me. Because you cannot win. You have never been able to win. And every battle you thought you won was a battle I allowed you to fight so that this moment would be possible. Then he said something that broke me completely, irreparably, in a way that I knew I would never be put back together the same way again. He said, "Abdul Karim, do you know why I came to you as a lion?" I shook my head. I could not speak. He said, because you call yourself the Lion of Islam. You prowl through the earth seeking my people to devour them. You roar with your sermons and your fatwas and your raids. You believe you are the most powerful predator in the spiritual world, but I wanted you to see the real lion. I am the lion of the tribe of Judah. I am the one who conquered death. I am the one who holds the keys of hell and the grave. You are not a lion, Abdul Karim. You are a lamb who has been pretending to be a lion. And I am the shepherd who has come to bring you home. He stretched out his scarred hand toward me and said, come to me. Stop fighting, stop running, stop pretending. Come to me and I will give you rest. You are tired. You have been tired for years. The weight of your hatred is crushing you. The burden of your war against me is breaking your back. You were not created for war. You were created for love. And I am offering you love right now. Not the conditional love of a religion that keeps a score. Unconditional love. The love of a God who died for you while you were still his enemy. Take my hand and let me show you who you were meant to be. I broke. The grand Imam of the Grand Mosque of Makkah broke like a clay pot dropped on marble. I did not just kneel. I collapsed. My face hit the floor. My body convulsed with sobs so violent that I could not breathe. I lay on the floor of a room inside the Grand Mosque crying harder than I had cried at my father's funeral, harder than I had ever cried in my entire life. And through the tears, through the snot and the gasping and the shaking, I said the words that ended one life and began another. I said, forgive me, Jesus. I believe you. I believe you are the Son of God. I believe you died for me. I believe you rose again. Forgive me for fighting you. Forgive me for hunting your people. Forgive me for burning your word. Forgive me for everything. I am yours. Take me. I am yours. And I felt his hand, not on my body, on my soul, warm, strong, gentle, lifting me out of 57 years of darkness into a light that would never go out. I do not know how long I lay on that floor. Time had no meaning in his presence. Minutes could have been hours. Hours could have been minutes. The only thing I know is that when I finally lifted my face from the marble, the room looked normal again. The golden light was gone. The fluorescent ceiling light was back on, buzzing faintly the way it always did. The Quran stand was still toppled on the floor. The shattered glass of water was still scattered in tiny pieces near the bed. The blanket was still crumbled where I had been thrown off the mattress by the force of the roarer. Everything in the physical world looked exactly as it had before. But I was not the same man who had fallen asleep in that room. That man was dead. The Grand Imam who had led 3 million people in prayer hours earlier was gone. In his place was a newborn, a man with the body and the memories and the knowledge of a 57-year-old Islamic scholar, but with the soul of an infant who had just taken his first breath in a world he did not understand. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and I stared at the Quran, his lying on the ground where it had fallen from the toppled stand. The book I had memorized at 12, the book I had recited for millions, the book I had built my entire life upon. It lay on the marble floor with its pages open and I felt nothing when I looked at it. No reverence, no connection, no sense of the sacred. It was paper and ink. That is all it was now. Paper and ink arranged into words that I had believed were divine for 57 years, but that I now knew were incomplete at best and false at worst. Because the God I had just met in this room was not the God described in those pages. The God I met had a face. He had hands with the scars. He had a voice that spoke my name with love instead of authority. He had come to me, not as a master demanding submission, but as a shepherd searching for a lost sheep. None of this existed in the Quran. The Allah of the Quran did not have a son. The Allah of the Quran did not die on a cross. The Allah of the Quran did not come to earth in human form and walk among his creation, but Jesus did. And Jesus was standing in this room minutes ago showing me the scars that proved everything. I knew I was in danger, immediate mortal danger. If anyone discovered what had just happened to me, I would be dead within hours, not days, hours. A grand Imam who converts to Christianity inside the Grand Mosque on the night of power during Ramadan. The religious establishment would view it as the greatest act of treason in the history of Islam, greater than any political betrayal, greater than any military defection. This was spiritual treason at the highest possible level. The man who led the prayers at the Kaaba had been claimed by the enemy. The Lion of Islam had been captured by the Lion of Judah. If this became public, it would not just be a scandal. It would be an earthquake that could crack the foundations of the Islamic world. And the men who ran that world would do anything, absolutely anything, to prevent that from happening, including killing me, especially killing me. My death would be far easier to manage than my testimony. I needed to think clearly. I needed to plan. But my mind was not functioning the way it normally did. The encounter with Jesus had rewired something inside me. The strategic, calculating mind that had planned raids and designed persecution protocols and coordinated international anti-Christian campaigns was still there, but it was operating under new management. Every thought was filtered through a new lens. A lens of truth that made everything I saw look different. The Quran on the floor was not divine revelation. It was a human document that had been used to enslave billions of souls. The Grand Mosque outside my door was not the house of God. It was a monument to a system of control that kept people walking in circles around a stone while the real God stood among them, unseen. The position I held was not a sacred trust. It was a throne built on lies that I had used to crush the very people Jesus loved. Everything looked different, and the man looking at everything was different too. I stayed in that room until Fajr prayer. I heard the adhan echo through the mosque complex, calling the faithful to the first prayer of the day. I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my door. Other imams and officials moving toward the prayer hall to take their positions. In minutes, someone would knock on my door expecting me to come out and lead the prayer. The Grand Imam leading Fajr on the morning after the night of power. It was expected. It was required. Millions of worshippers would be waiting. I stood up and looked at myself in the small bathroom mirror. Red, swollen eyes from hours of weeping. A face that looked 10 years older than it had the night before. Creases in my forehead that had not been there yesterday. The physical evidence of a soul being torn apart and reassembled by hands far more powerful than any human surgeon. I washed my face with cold water. I straightened my thobe. I put on my shimak and agyal, and I opened the door. I led the prayer. I stood at the microphone in front of the Kaaba and recited Surah Al-Fatiha, and the congregation followed. 2 million voices responding to mine. Amin echoing through the courtyard like a wave. I bowed, they bowed, I prostrated, they prostrated. I went through every motion with mechanical precision while inside my heart was screaming. I was reciting words I no longer believed to a God I had just discovered was not who I thought he was, while the real God, the one with the scarred hands and a lion's roar, watched me from somewhere I could not see. The hypocrisy was suffocating, but I knew I had to endure it temporarily. If I refused to lead the prayer or showed any sign of what had happened, the machinery of the Islamic establishment would activate instantly. I would be questioned, examined, investigated. And if they discovered the truth, I would never leave this mosque alive. Over the next 3 weeks, I lived the most agonizing double life imaginable. I continued to perform my duties as Grand Imam. I led prayers. I delivered sermons. I attended council meetings. I issued religious rulings. I sat in the Sharia council chamber and discussed matters of Islamic law with men who would have executed me on the spot if they knew what was in my heart. Every moment was torture. Every prayer I led felt like a betrayal of Jesus. Every sermon I delivered felt like a lie falling from lips that had kissed the feet of the true God just days earlier. But I endured it because I knew I needed time. Time to plan my exit. Time to arrange my escape from a country that would never let me leave alive if they knew the truth. I began making preparations in secret. I used my position to arrange an international trip, a conference on interfaith dialogue in Geneva, Switzerland. The irony was exquisite. The man who had used interfaith platforms to attack Christianity was now using one to escape from Islam. I submitted the travel request through the normal channels. It was approved without suspicion. The Grand Imam traveling to Europe for a conference was routine. I had done it dozens of times. No one questioned it. I booked flights. I arranged accommodation. I packed a bag with only essential items. And I made one additional arrangement that no one knew about. I contacted a Christian organization through an encrypted messaging application that I had found during late-night searches on my phone in the bathroom of my quarters. I told them I was a senior Islamic religious figure in Saudi Arabia who had recently encountered Jesus Christ. I told them I needed help. I told them I needed protection. And I told them I wanted to record my testimony on camera once I was safely outside the kingdom. The day I left Saudi Arabia, I walked through King Abdulaziz International Airport in Jeddah wearing my official religious garments, white thobe, red shimak, black agal, the gold-trimmed bishet cloak that senior religious officials wore. Airport staff recognized me. Security officers nodded respectfully. Airline personnel escorted me to the first-class lounge. I was treated with the deference that the Grand Imam of the Grand Mosque of Mecca commanded everywhere in the kingdom. I sat in the lounge sipping Arabic coffee looking out at the planes on the tarmac. And I thought about Maria, the Filipino nurse. He is standing right beside you, Sheikh. You just cannot see him yet. She was right. He had been beside me all along, in every airport, on every stage, in every room where I had planned persecution. He was there, waiting, patient, following the man who was hunting his people with the same love he had shown me on the floor of the mosque. I whispered under my breath so quietly that no one could hear. I see you now. I finally see you. And I am coming to you. Then I boarded the plane and left the kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the last time. I landed in Geneva on a Tuesday afternoon. The plane touched down at Geneva International Airport, and when the wheels hit the runway, I felt a physical sensation of release, like a chain being cut from around my chest. I was out. I was free. I was standing on soil where the name of Jesus could be spoken without a death sentence attached to it. The conference I had used as my cover was real. It was being held at a hotel near the Palais des Nations, the European headquarters of the United Nations. I checked into my hotel room. I attended the opening session. I shook hands with the religious leaders and academics and diplomats who had no idea that the Grand Imam sitting among them had been claimed by Jesus Christ 3 weeks earlier on the floor of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. I played my role for 2 days. I participated in panels. I gave a short lecture on Islamic perspectives on peace. I smiled and nodded and performed the character of Sheikh Abdul Karim al-Makki one final time. And then on the third day I disappeared. The Christian organization I had contacted from Saudi Arabia had arranged everything. A man named Andreas met me at a coffee shop in the old town of Geneva near the Saint-Pierre Cathedral. He was a Swiss, tall, quiet. He spoke Arabic with a slight accent that told me he had spent time in the Middle East. He did not ask me unnecessary questions. He simply said, "Brother, are you ready?" I said yes. He drove me in a rented car to a small apartment in Lausanne, about 60 kilometers from Geneva. The apartment had been prepared as a safe house. Curtains drawn, no identifying information anywhere. A small camera on a tripod set up in the living room, facing a plain white wall. 2 lights on either side. A chair in the center. Andreas introduced me to a woman named Sophia, who operated the camera, and a man named David, who would manage the audio. They were calm and professional and treated me with a gentleness that I did not deserve given what I had spent my life doing to their brothers and sisters in Saudi Arabia. I sat in the chair. I was still wearing my thobe and shimar. I had debated whether to change into Western clothes, but I decided against it. I wanted the world to see me exactly as I was. A Saudi religious leader in full official dress, the Grand Imam of the Grand Mosque of Mecca. Not hiding behind a disguise or a fake name or a blurred face. Me, the real me, the man who had persecuted Christians with the same hands that were now folded in his lap, trembling with the weight of what he was about to do. Andreas asked me if I was ready. I took a deep breath. I looked into the camera and I said, "My name is Sheikh Abdul Karim al-Makki. I am the Grand Imam of the Grand Mosque of Mecca. I have led prayers at the Kaaba for over 20 years. I have served on the Chief Council of Sharia law. I have memorized the entire Quran. I have debated Christian scholars across Europe and declared the supremacy of Islam on every stage I have ever stood on. And I am here today to tell you that 3 weeks ago, Jesus Christ appeared to me inside the Grand Mosque in Mecca, and everything I believed was shattered in a single night. I told them everything. I started from the beginning, my family, my father, my grandfather, 4 generations of Imams serving the Grand Mosque. I told them about my education in Medina, my rise through the religious establishment, my appointment as Grand Imam. I told them about my war against Christianity, the raids, the arrests, the burning of Bibles, Maria the Filipino nurse in handcuffs looking up at me, saying he is standing right beside you. I told them about my travels across Europe, mocking Jesus on television and in debate halls, my public ridicule of Muslims who claim to see Jesus in dreams, my absolute certainty that Christianity was a corrupted religion with no power and no truth. Then I told them about the night of power, the 23rd night of Ramadan, leading 3 million people in prayer, sleeping in my room inside the Grand Mosque, the roar that shook the walls, the golden light, the lion with a mane of fire and eyes of molten gold standing in the center of the room, the voice that said, I am the Lion of the tribe of Judah. I have conquered. You have spent your life fighting me. Now look at me and see who I really am. I described the transformation, the lion becoming a man, the white robe of woven light, the face that shone like the sun, the feet like burnished bronze, and the hands. The scarred hands held out toward me, palms up, the crucifixion wounds that I had denied for decades, staring back at me from the flesh of the living God. I described how Jesus spoke to me about every Christian I had persecuted, every Bible I had burned, every word I had spoken against his name. How he told me he had been standing beside me the entire time, not to judge me, to save me. How he told me I was not a lion but a lamb pretending to be a lion. How he called himself the shepherd who had come to bring me home. How he stretched out his scarred hand and said, come to me and I will give you rest. And how I fell on my face on the floor of the Grand Mosque and surrendered my life to Jesus Christ. I was weeping by the time I finished. The camera was still rolling. Sophia was crying behind the lens. David had his head bowed and his shoulders were shaking. Andreas stood against the wall with tears running silently down his face. The room was filled with the presence of God. The same presence I had felt in the mosque. Warm, heavy, real. I looked into the camera one final time and I said, I want to speak to every Muslim watching this. I was the man who hated Jesus more than any person on earth. I was the man who dedicated his life to destroying his name and persecuting his followers. I stood on stages across the world and declared that Jesus had no power, that he was merely a prophet, that his followers were deluded and deceived. And then the real Jesus walked into my room in the Grand Mosque of Mecca on the holiest night of Ramadan and showed me who he really is. Not a prophet, not a man, the Lion of Judah, the Son of God, the King of Kings. And he did not come to condemn me. He came to save me. If he can save me, the Grand Imam of Mecca, the #1 enemy of his name on earth, then he can save anyone. He can save you. The video was uploaded through encrypted channels and shared through diaspora networks and underground Christian communities across the Middle East. For the first 72 hours, it spread quietly, viewed by thousands, then tens of thousands, mostly among Christian communities and ex-Muslim networks outside the Arab world. Then the Saudi authorities caught wind of it. They moved immediately. Within hours, the video was blocked on every major platform accessible inside Saudi Arabia. Internet service providers were ordered to flag and block any URL containing my name or references to the testimony. The Ministry of Islamic Affairs issued a classified directive to all media outlets prohibiting any mention of the video. Social media accounts that shared it were reported and suspended. The regime deployed its full digital suppression apparatus. Teams of government-linked accounts flooded comment sections with accusations that the video was a deepfake produced by Israeli intelligence. They released statements claiming I had suffered a mental breakdown and was receiving psychiatric treatment at a facility in Europe. They said the video was fabricated. They said I had been kidnapped by Western intelligence agencies. They said everything they could think of to discredit what they could not contain. But they could not contain it. The video had already escaped the kingdom's digital borders. It spread through Telegram channels in Iraq and Egypt and Jordan. It spread through WhatsApp groups in Pakistan and Indonesia and Malaysia. It spread through encrypted applications used by underground believers across the Gulf states. It spread through Christian satellite television channels that broadcast into Iranian and Arab homes. And then it broke through into mainstream international media. A British newspaper ran the story first, then a French television channel, then American networks. Within 2 weeks, the video had been viewed over 60 million times globally. And then it reached back into Saudi Arabia through VPNs and encrypted sharing and USB drives, passed hand to hand in coffee shops and university campuses and military barracks. The Saudi authorities had tried to build a dam, but the water found every crack and poured through. The protests began in Mecca. Thousands of Muslims gathered near the Grand Mosque demanding answers. How could the Grand Imam abandon Islam? How could the man who led them in prayer betray the faith? How could this happen in the holiest mosque in the world on the holiest night of the year? The protests spread to Jeddah within hours, then Riyadh, then Medina, then Dammam and Tabuk and Abha and every major city in the kingdom. Hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, chanting, waving flags, demanding my arrest, demanding my execution, demanding that the government explain how the spiritual leader of Islam's holiest site had been lost to the enemy. The regime responded with force and with narrative. They officially stripped me of my title. They erased my name from every record associated with the Grand Mosque. They issued a statement saying I had been removed from my position months earlier due to undisclosed health issues, and that the video was a fabrication designed to destabilize the kingdom. My family in Mecca was pressured to release a statement disowning me. My brother read it on camera. He said, Abdul Karim al-Makki is no longer a member of this family. He has betrayed Allah and His Messenger. We condemn his apostasy, and we ask Allah to guide him back to the truth or punish him for his treachery. But the messages that poured in from across the Muslim world told a different story than the one the regime was trying to write. Thousands of messages from people who watched the video and were shaken to their core. Messages from Imams in Egypt who said, I have been feeling empty for years, and your testimony cracked something open inside me. Messages from women in Pakistan who said, I have been beaten by my husband in the name of Islam, and hearing that Jesus sees me and loves me gave me hope for the first time. Messages from young Saudis who said, I have been secretly questioning Islam for years, but I was too afraid to speak, and your courage gave me permission to search for the truth. Messages from Hezbollah fighters in Lebanon who said, if the Grand Imam of Mecca can leave Islam, then maybe everything we have been fighting for is a lie. And messages from secret believers across the Muslim world who said, I met Jesus too, but I was too afraid to tell anyone, and now I know I am not alone. I want to end with a message for the Muslim world. I know the protests are still happening. I know the streets of Saudi Arabia are filled with people demanding my blood. I know the regime is doing everything in its power to erase me and discredit my testimony. But I also know something they do not. I know who walked into my room on the night of power. I know whose voice shook the walls of the Grand Mosque. I know whose scars I saw on those outstretched hands. And I know that the same Jesus who found me in the most fortified room, in the most fortified mosque, in the most fortified country on earth can find anyone anywhere. No wall is thick enough to keep him out. No security system is sophisticated enough to detect him. No religious authority is powerful enough to stop him. He walks through walls. He walks through defenses. He walks through decades of hatred and persecution and religious certainty, and he stands in front of you and says, "Come to me. I spent my life as the lion of Islam hunting the followers of Jesus." Then the real lion walked into my room, and I discovered I was never the hunter. I was the prey, and he caught me. If this testimony has shaken something inside you, write in the comments, "The lion has roared." Let it be a declaration over the Muslim world. Let it be a warning to every religious leader who persecutes the followers of Jesus. Let it be a signal to every secret believer hiding in every mosque and every home in every Islamic country on earth. The Lion of Judah is not a story. He is not a metaphor. He is not a symbol. He is alive. He is real. He is hunting. And he will not stop until every soul he died for has heard his roar and had the chance to respond. He found me in the Grand Mosque of Mecca on the night of power. If he can find me there, he can find you wherever you are. Just listen. You will hear him roar.